very shy child. But one thing I knew was that I had to find ways to break out of that. So I took every opportunity I could to take a public stage. I volunteered for the school debating team, only took part in one debate ever in my school years, but it shocked everybody because they didn't think that I could actually stand up in front of an audience because I was so shy. And I took that learning through into my adult life, taking every opportunity to speak in public. And I discovered that I had a voice, that people would listen to me when I spoke. So that was a massive learning, but forcing myself into that also not just set me on a path to a speaking career, but also boosted my confidence in general. The first 10 years or so of becoming a speaker, after I wrote my first book and people asked me to talk about that book, I didn't know there was such a thing as a professional speaking circuit or fraternity. And I learned by trial and error. But then as I became a professional speaker, I discovered that there was an entire community of these speakers. And I also discovered that this community was an incredibly supportive community. And people like Steph du Plessis, the founder of the Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa, and Paul du Toit, who wrote a book called The Exceptional Speaker, were key supporters and influencers and inspiration for that journey. And then in more recent years, as the virtual presenting environment became the core of the profession, I found great inspiration from people like Alan Stevens, who hosts the remote speaking community on Facebook, Roger Colville, who wrote the Virtual Presenter's Handbook, and David Averin, who has an amazing setup and an approach to how he uses that setup. All of these have been great inspirations to me. And then my predecessor as president of the Johannesburg chapter of the Professional Speakers Association of Southern Africa, Nikki Bush, with whom I co-authored a book called Tech Savvy Parenting, which is right over there. She pushed me hard to get more involved in the association. And that was prior to the COVID-19 lockdown. But that actually was a critical step in my career in terms of becoming even more involved and becoming an almost activist in the speaker community. There's a nasty little secret in the speaking profession, and that is that the profession has thrived during the pandemic. And that might not be true for everybody, but as a whole, what we have found is that there has been far more budget for speakers because the budget hasn't had to be spent on the events and logistics themselves. And the result of that is if you were able to plug yourself into the speaking environment and into the needs of the corporate world, you actually had a very busy time. So personally, last year, 2020, was the busiest year of my career. But there was another side to it, and that was understanding that not everyone had the fortune to already be digital and to be in demand to speak on digital platforms. And this happened to coincide with when I became heavily involved as vice president of our local chapter of the Professional Speakers Association, and found that I had a far more significant role to play than I had imagined previously. Had it remained a physical environment with physical meetings, I would have been standing up at meetings and talking about the usual things we talk about at meetings, helping to organize, etc., and occasionally talking about the technology that people should use in the speaking profession. But with the pandemic, suddenly there was a significant new role of not just sharing my experience of speaking virtually, which I'd been doing for around 5 years as part of my broader speaking activity, but also guiding people and almost laying down the ground rules of virtual speaking. And I found myself taking a leadership role, not in terms of the organization as such, but rather in terms of saying, this is what you have to do in terms of being a professional speaker in a time of virtual and remote events. And part of that was to say to people, you don't cut your rates just because you're speaking virtually. You weren't being paid previously for turning up. You weren't being paid because of your body on a stage. You were being paid because of the expertise you had to share or the message that you were putting across. And that doesn't change. And the reality is that for the event organizer, the cost of the event is so much lower virtually than it was physically. So why on earth should you be discounting your rates simply because you're speaking from home wearing pajama pants and a smart shirt? That certainly is not part of the equation of pricing speaking. So that was the first message that I pushed very hard. And generally that became a kind of almost conventional wisdom in the organization. Some people still felt that they had to discount, and some organizations still demanded discounting. But by taking a strong stance on that, I found that I very seldom got pushback, except when there was a budget issue, but that budget issue would have existed anyway. The second big learning for me and message that I've tried to lead with is that in a time of having to rely on technology to give your talks, you can't let the technology dominate or dictate what you say, how you say it, and your entire demeanor on that virtual stage. And if you have too much technology, the technology is going to be in control. So my message has been to keep it simple, to strip it down to the bare bones of what you need. So I've tried to apply that in my own environment. It doesn't apply for every speaker. If you're a David Avron or a Steph du Plessis or a Graham Codrington, you are going to use all the technology at your disposal to create a stage that almost adapts to the audience that you're talking to or to the message that you want to put across. And that's fine. If you are able to work comfortably with complicated technology, by all means do so. But if you can get away with, for example, a laptop that's got a decent webcam and decent speakers and a ring light perhaps to assist you on your way, then that is really all you need. And you shouldn't stress about whether you have a snowball microphone or a high definition camera. And there's one other dirty secret of cameras, and that is that the camera on your cell phone is probably far superior to anything that you could buy as a standalone camera. So as a last resort, that is also an option. But it's these kind of messages of the rules of pricing don't change, firstly, and the rules of the equipment you use shouldn't change that dramatically. If any of those change significantly, for the average speaker, you're doing something wrong. So those are the kind of messages that I tried to put across. But what I also discovered in pushing those kind of messages is that I had a new role to play in the organization and in the speaking profession as a whole. And I didn't expect that. I didn't expect to become what you might call a thought leader, not a popular term in some circles, but a thought leader in speaking itself, as opposed to what I'm speaking about. One thing I started doing during lockdown was to try and reduce complexity in my environment, not just in my speaking environment, but in my home and office environment, and trying to strip life down to the bare necessities. And I'm not talking about austerity or anything extreme like that, but rather trying to reduce clutter in my mind, on my desk, and in my life. And among other things, I've made a massive effort to eliminate paper from my environment, for example, to clear all my old paper files. The stuff of personal significance is carefully filed, but anything that's not essential has been thrown out. And carloads and carloads went to the paper dump to get rid of stuff that I didn't really need. And in the process also discovered a huge amount of possessions, especially old technology, that I no longer used, no longer needed, and that no one else needed. So some went to charity, some went to the dump, and I found that I was able to make my life far more controlled in general because of having reduced that clutter. Now, that is an approach that I want to bring to all aspects of my profession, from the writing side of things, bring things far more under control by having less clutter. One of the big challenges there is getting my email pile under control. But I have in the past, and I can again in the future. But in the speaking environment as well, I want to see if I can become even more efficient and more functional in terms of how I can do more with far less that is required to make it happen. And that again is all about reducing complexity and reducing moving parts. So part of my thesis is that the more moving parts you have, in other words, the more ingredients you have in your technology, the more can go wrong. The fewer the moving parts, the less that can go wrong. Now, not all speakers agree with that. But the point there is if you're comfortable with the technology, that's absolutely fine. You can really make it work for you, and you can make it sing for you, in effect. But if you're not comfortable with technology, then rather strip it down so that you are focusing on your speaking instead of focusing on the tech. Now, I love technology. I love gadgets. So part of my mission will be to see if I can, for example, take a smartphone and with the smartphone alone have the same experience and the same presentation presence that I do with a laptop and a webcam and a ring light, for example. So I'll be experimenting with less. And that doesn't mean that I'm technophobic or trying to get away from the technology. Quite the opposite. I'm actually trying to get closer to the technology, but by making it work for me and making it work as simply as possible with as few moving parts as possible. One of them was that I was always concerned that I wasn't practiced enough, that I wasn't smooth enough. But then I discovered something very interesting, that people pick this up as authenticity. And that has become one of the bywords of the speaking profession. You have to be authentic. So by not being glib and practiced, I found that I was coming across as more authentic. And I've subsequently found that some of the most celebrated speakers in the country and in the world are, in fact, incredibly glib and far too practiced, and I don't enjoy watching them or listening to them. And I'm sure there must be others in audiences that feel the same way. Of course, the fact that they get the levels of bookings that they do means that not everyone feels that way, that for many corporate audiences or corporate events, they're looking for exactly that. But I realized I don't have to be that. I can be me, and I can continue to be me and not have to worry about the people who come across as ultra professional. Ultra professional often doesn't go with authenticity. A second key insight over the years was that reading from a script meant that you felt tied down to what you had written before rather than responding to what the audience was responding to. And I found that the more I went off script, the more natural the interaction became. And the more I responded to what people in the audience were laughing at or gasping at, perhaps, also the more relevant the talk became to that audience. Now, that is also something that takes experience, and it takes some level of confidence to be able to speak off the cuff on something that you hadn't planned to speak about. But I discovered something else about myself. I actually enjoyed that kind of interaction. And by being more natural, I found myself enjoying the talk more, and therefore my audience enjoyed it more because the audience picks up on your enjoyment of them. So it's not only about sticking to the rules or sticking to step A, B, or C. It's also about being adaptable and therefore also being more engaging with your audience. Third and final insight is that you often are speaking to an audience that seems far more knowledgeable than you ought to be. So, for example, if you're speaking to an audience of actuaries or accountants and you're not an actuary or accountant, you imagine that they know far more than you do about the topic you're about to present to them. But the reality is they are experts in their very specific area of expertise. So when you overlay your expertise over their profession, so in my case, the use of technology or the use of artificial intelligence, in accounting or in actuarial science, they haven't been exposed to that kind of thinking. Some of them have, and there will be the odd person in the audience who can actually interrupt, but rather contribute. That's the way I see those kind of interruptions or people wanting to add something to what you've said. But generally speaking, most people in an expert audience don't have the level of expertise you do that you can overlay onto their expertise. So what you're really doing is you're contributing to their knowledge. You're not contradicting or competing with their knowledge. My top tip comes out of a conversation that was held in Alan Stevens' remote speaking group on Facebook, where people raised the question of whether they should ask an audience to keep their video cameras on while they're speaking. And there was a lot of debate around that. And I gave some thought and then provided my input. And the more I thought about the input I gave, the more I realized that this is actually one of the key demands of speaking remotely and something that people need to work on in the coming year while events remain virtual, and also in the future when we are going to find an extensive use of hybrid events, virtual and physical. And this is the issue. The reason people often ask their audience to keep the video cameras on is that they want the feeling of speaking to a live audience. So they are really asking the audience to make themselves more comfortable, themselves the speakers more comfortable, rather than the audience being comfortable. But unless there's a good reason for the audience to keep the cameras on for their own purposes, such as interaction that is part of the event, or actions that the speaker asks the audience to perform on video, then the only reason that you are really demanding that is to make yourself as a speaker more comfortable. And that is wrong. Your role isn't to ask the audience to make you more comfortable, and the audience's role isn't to make you more comfortable. Your role is to make the audience more comfortable. And the average person attending an event, participating in the webinar and the like, is uncomfortable with having the video camera on because it means that they feel compelled to constantly be focused on the screen. And that is exhausting. You are really making the audience extremely uncomfortable if there isn't a reason for keeping the video cameras on, aside from making you, the speaker, more comfortable. So you have to start learning to speak to a camera and to a screen where people may not be interacting or may not be visible. And it's not easy. For a lot of people, it's extremely uncomfortable. But you, as a professional speaker, that is part of your role and your responsibility to become comfortable just speaking to that camera. Will robots and software replace the professional speaker? I'll be talking about the speaker of the future and how artificial intelligence is going to change the profession. Mostly, though, I'll be telling you why you shouldn't be afraid of AI, but also why and how you should embrace AI.